In the summer of 1985, a young traffic cop finished her late-night shift. She radioed in one last time, calm and professional, and then she disappeared. Her patrol car never came back. Her family waited by the door, but she never walked through it. And here's the part no one can explain. How does a uniformed officer in a marked police cruiser just vanish off the face of the earth? At first, people thought maybe she ran away, but others whispered something far darker. Had she been ambushed? Did someone inside her own department want her gone? For 18 years, the town searched. For 18 years, her family lit candles, begging for answers. And then, during a violent storm, when a highway bridge collapsed into the river below, workers uncovered something buried deep in the mud. It was a discovery that would finally reveal what happened that night. But the truth was nothing anyone expected. You're watching Secret Haze. And trust me, you'll want to stick around until the very end of this story. Because once you hear what was pulled out of that river, you'll never look at accidents the same way again. Before we dive in, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this story from right now? In 1985, there was a young traffic cop named Officer Karen. She was 27 years old, and everyone in her small town knew her. If you lived there, you had probably seen her at some point. Maybe she pulled you over for speeding. Maybe you just waved to her as she drove by in her cruiser. People said she was strict when she had to be. If you broke the rules on the road, she wasn't going to let you off easy. But she was also fair. If she stopped a teenager who was scared out of their mind, she would explain the rules calmly instead of yelling. If someone apologized honestly, she would sometimes give just a warning. Karen had dreamed of being an officer since she was a teenager. Her father had been in the military, and she admired his discipline. She loved the idea of protecting people, keeping order, and being someone the community could rely on. When she finally put on that uniform for the first time, she stood taller. She was proud of the badge, the gun belt, the cruiser with the flashing lights. In town, she became a symbol of safety. Parents would say, "Don't worry, Officer Karen's on patrol tonight." Kids would wave when her car passed. People felt calmer knowing she was out there, watching the roads, ready to help anyone in trouble. She wasn't married, but she was close with her family. She lived not far from her parents and would often stop by for dinner after a shift. Her mother said she was careful, maybe even too careful sometimes. But that was part of her job. In 1985, highways in rural areas could be lonely and dangerous. There weren't many streetlights, and once the sun went down, the roads felt endless and dark. Crashes happened often. Drunk drivers were common. Hitchhikers, broken-down cars, and shady strangers on the side of the road were all things a cop had to watch for. But if anyone could handle it, it was her. She was trained, she was tough, and she wasn't the type to panic. That's why when she went missing, it didn't make sense. She wasn't careless. She wasn't reckless. She knew those roads better than anyone. In the summer of 1985, Officer Karen put on her uniform, buckled her gun belt, and climbed into her cruiser for what everyone thought was just another shift. No one had any idea it would be her last. It was a quiet night on the highway. The sun had gone down hours earlier, and the only light came from the headlights of passing cars and the glowing red and blue of her dashboard. Officer Karen drove slowly along the two-lane road. She knew the routine: check for speeders, watch for broken-down vehicles, keep an eye out for drunk drivers weaving between lanes. Most of the time it was boring work, but boring was good. It meant nothing was wrong. That night she made a few stops: a driver going too fast, a car pulled over with a flat tire. She wrote down notes, called into dispatch when she needed to, and then continued on. Everything about the shift felt ordinary. Around her, the road stretched on into farmland and woods. At night, it could feel like the middle of nowhere. Sometimes, the silence was broken by the sound of a semi-truck roaring past. Other times, minutes would go by with nothing but the hum of her engine. Karen stayed alert. She knew accidents could happen in a second, but as the hours passed, nothing unusual came up. It was the kind of shift she had worked dozens of times before. Near midnight, she started heading toward the end of her route. She was tired, ready to go home, maybe grab a late snack before bed. She'd done her job well and the road seemed calm. But there was something about that night that no one could explain. On the surface, it looked just like any other shift. But for reasons no one would understand for nearly 2 decades, this would be the last one she ever worked. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Officer Karen picked up her radio. Her voice came through clearly at the dispatch center. "All clear," she said. It was short, simple, routine. She sounded calm, professional, exactly how she always did. The dispatcher noted the time. Nothing seemed unusual. But what no one realized in that moment was that those 2 words would be the last anyone ever heard from her. After that call, silence. Dispatch expected to hear from her again soon. Usually, an officer would check in every so often, but minutes turned into an hour and nothing came through. Other officers tried to reach her on the radio. No response. At first, they assumed she was busy, maybe helping someone on the side of the road. It wasn't unusual for radio calls to be delayed if something urgent was happening. But as the clock ticked on, unease started to grow. They tried again, still nothing. By 1 a.m., supervisors began to worry. They called her car directly. No answer. They sent another officer to drive the route she was supposed to be on, but the highway was empty. Her cruiser was gone. By morning, her family knew something was wrong too. She hadn't come home. She hadn't called. Her bed was still neatly made, her dinner leftovers still in the fridge. For someone so reliable, this was unthinkable. The last known fact was simple. Officer Karen had radioed in to say, "All clear." Then she disappeared into the night. After her calm radio call, dispatch expected her to check in again soon. But then, silence. At first, no one thought much of it. Radios cut out sometimes. Maybe she was in a dead zone. Maybe she was pulling someone over and didn't have time to respond. But as the minutes turned into nearly half an hour, her colleagues started to get uneasy. They tried calling her again. "Unit 27, do you copy?" "Static." They waited, tried again, nothing. The dispatcher looked at the clock, then called another officer on patrol. "Can you drive her route? See if she's tied up with something." The other officer headed out. He cruised along the dark highway, scanning the shoulders, the ditches, the side roads. Nothing. No flashing lights, no stopped car, no sign of her. By now, unease had crept into the entire shift. Officers knew Karen was reliable. She didn't ignore her radio. She didn't disappear. If she wasn't answering, something had to be wrong. But there was no crash scene, no broken glass, no skid marks. It was as if her cruiser had been swallowed by the night. Back at her house, the hours dragged on. Her family expected to hear the familiar sound of her patrol car pulling into the driveway. The engine, the slam of the car door, the footsteps on the porch. But the house stayed silent. By 2 a.m., her mother was packing the living room. By 3 a.m., her father stood at the window, staring out at the empty street. They kept telling themselves she was fine. Maybe she got held up on a case. Maybe paperwork kept her late. But when dawn broke and her bed was still untouched, panic hit hard. Her brother called the station. The answer chilled him. She never checked back in. Her family's relief turned into dread. Karen wasn't careless. If she was missing, it wasn't by choice. Neighbors heard the news quickly. Some came by the house to sit with the family. Others joined the search parties already forming. But that first morning, the truth was clear. A police officer in full uniform had vanished. She didn't just disappear from her shift. She didn't just miss a call. She never made it home at all. Through the night, officers kept checking the usual places. Maybe her cruiser had broken down. Maybe she had pulled off the road for repairs. They drove every stretch of highway she was assigned to cover. They checked gas stations, roadside diners, and the small pull-offs where she sometimes stopped to write reports. But there was nothing. Her car wasn't on the road. It wasn't in a ditch. It wasn't anywhere. Dispatch called her again and again. "Unit 27, do you copy?" The words echoed into static each time. No response. The other patrol officers grew restless. They knew what a breakdown looked like. They knew what a delayed stop looked like. This wasn't either of those things. The highway itself felt wrong, endless and empty, like it had swallowed her whole. Every mile they drove only deepened the mystery. There was no trace of her, No tire marks, no flares, no flashing lights. It was as if the night had opened up and taken her. By the time the sun started to rise, the truth was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a radio error. This wasn't a late night at the office. This wasn't a breakdown. A uniformed police officer, inside a marked patrol car, had vanished into thin air. At the station, tension was thick. Supervisors flipped through her shift records. Everything had been normal until her last call, all clear, then silence. No warnings, no distress call, nothing to suggest danger. The chief made the call. She was officially missing. That morning, every available officer was pulled in. Search grids were drawn up. Helicopters were requested. The roads were mapped. What had started as a routine shift now looked like the start of a nightmare. For her family, the realization hit even harder. Their daughter, the careful, disciplined officer who always came home, was gone. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. In the small town, rumors spread fast. How could a cop just vanish? It didn't seem possible. People whispered that something dark must have happened. And they were right. Because what happened to Officer Karen that night would stay hidden for nearly 2 decades, until a freak accident uncovered the truth. The disappearance of a police officer was not just unusual, it was an emergency. Within hours, the department turned the small town into a staging ground. Every available officer was called in. Roadblocks went up on highways leading out of town. Officers flagged down cars, asking drivers if they had seen her cruiser. They held up her photo, hoping someone had spotted her. Search teams were organized in grids. Volunteers lined up in fields, walking shoulder to shoulder, scanning for any sign of tire tracks or a crash site. Farmers allowed officers onto their land, letting them check barns, sheds, and back roads. Helicopters were called in from the state police. Spotlights cut through the night sky, sweeping over forests, fields, and rivers. The chief made it clear this wasn't just another missing person. This was one of their own. That made it personal. Inside the command post, maps were spread across tables. Red markers showed every place they had checked. Blue markers showed the areas still untouched. The search zone grew wider and wider. But as the hours stretched on, frustration grew. She had vanished on her patrol route, yet the more they searched, the less sense it made. From above, the countryside looked endless. Helicopter crews scanned every stretch of road, every patch of farmland, every wooded area. If a police cruiser had gone off the highway, surely they would spot it. But they saw nothing. The spotlight swept over ditches, rivers, and tree lines. The glow lit up the darkness like daylight. Yet every time the pilots shook their heads, still no car. On the ground, officers radioed up for updates. Anything. The answer was always the same: negative. The open sky gave the search a strange feeling. From up there, the town looked small, but the land around it looked huge and empty. If her car had left the road, it could be hidden anywhere, covered by trees, buried in mud, or sunk in water. Pilots circled again and again, straining their eyes. At one point, a crew thought they had spotted something, a glint of metal near a riverbank. Ground teams rushed to the spot, climbing down through thick brush. But when they reached it, it was only a piece of farm equipment. False alarms like this happened all night. Each one raised hope, then crushed it. By dawn, the helicopter teams had logged hours in the air. They had covered miles of highway, dozens of fields, and every bend in the main river. Still, there was no trace. The car wasn't on the road. It wasn't in the woods. From above, it was as if the cruiser had never existed at all. Next, searchers turned to the water. Along her patrol route were rivers, ponds, and small lakes. If her car had gone off the road, it could have slipped beneath the surface. Dive teams were called in. They suited up, pulled on heavy tanks, and dropped into the black water. The rivers were muddy and fast-moving. Visibility was almost zero. Divers had to feel along the bottom, searching by touch more than sight. Every time they came back up, the answer was the same: nothing. They tried ponds next. The water was still but thick with mud. Clouds of silt swirled around them as they searched. Again, nothing. The crews marked each spot as cleared and moved on. But with every failed dive, hope slipped further away. It was becoming clear. Whatever happened to her, it had left no easy trail to follow. With the skis and rivers coming up empty, the focus shifted to the ground. Deputies, troopers, and volunteers lined up at the edge of the woods. They stepped forward slowly, scanning every bush, every fallen log, every patch of dirt. K-9 units were brought in. Handlers gave the dogs pieces of her uniform to sniff. The dogs pulled hard on their leashes, noses to the ground, weaving through the trees. But each time, the trail went cold. Families in the community stepped up to help. Mothers brought boxes of sandwiches. Older folks brewed gallons of coffee and delivered it to the tired searchers. Kids handed out water bottles. The town had never come together like this before. But no matter how many boots hit the dirt, no matter how many miles of forest they searched, the result stayed the same. No car, no uniform, no trace. By the second night, frustration turned to fear. Even the most optimistic searchers began to realize this wasn't just someone lost in the woods. Something else had happened, something they couldn't see. And the longer she stayed missing, the darker people's thoughts became. By the third day, the search had grown desperate, and with desperation came rumors. Some whispered that she had been ambushed. Maybe someone flagged her down, pretending to need help, and then attacked when she stopped. Others wondered if she had crossed the wrong person during a traffic stop. Maybe someone wanted revenge. Then came an even darker idea. What if someone she trusted was involved? The thought spread quickly through town. She had worked side by side with her fellow officers. Could one of them have turned on her? The department hated hearing this, but they couldn't deny it either. With no car, no evidence, and no witnesses, every possibility had to be considered. For her family, the rumors were unbearable. They knew her better than anyone. She was disciplined, loyal, and proud of her job. She wouldn't run off. She wouldn't vanish by choice. But if she didn't leave willingly, that meant something much worse. Someone had taken her. By the end of the week, fear hung over the town like a shadow. Every knock at the door, every unknown car on the street felt suspicious. People double-locked their doors and looked over their shoulders. The mystery wasn't just about a missing officer anymore. It was about whether anyone in town could be trusted at all. At her family's home, the waiting became its own kind of torture. Her parents sat by the phone day and night, praying for it to ring with good news. Every knock on the door made their hearts stop. Police came often. Sometimes it was one officer, sometimes two. They always spoke carefully, as if trying not to break the family even more. But the message was always the same, nothing new. The silence was worse than an answer. If she had been found, even if it was bad news, at least they would know. But now all they had was questions. Her siblings tried to keep her memory alive. They placed her picture on the mantle, lit candles at night, and talked about her like she was still just at work. But the longer she stayed missing, the harder it became to pretend. Her mother refused to pack away her things. Her room stayed exactly the same, uniform pressed in the closet, shoes neatly lined by the bed, as if she might walk in the door at any moment. But deep down they all felt it. Something terrible had happened. Weeks turned into months. The search grew smaller. The helicopters stopped flying. The volunteers went home. Only a handful of detectives kept following leads, and even those leads dried up. Her patrol car was still missing. That fact haunted everyone. A police cruiser was big, heavy, and impossible to hide, but somehow it had vanished without a trace. With no answers, people began to make up their own. Some said she had run away, tired of the badge and the pressure of the job. Others whispered that maybe she had been living a secret life, one her family never knew about. Each rumor cut her parents deeper. They knew she wasn't like that. She wouldn't leave her family, and she wouldn't abandon her uniform. But as time passed, fewer people believed it was foul play. By the end of the year, the search had officially ended. Her case file was closed, stamped with one heavy word: unsolved. And just like that, the trail went cold. After the first year, hope started to fade. Detectives who once swore they wouldn't rest began moving on to other cases. Some retired, others transferred, and each time, the missing officer's file was passed to someone new. But nothing ever changed. Every lead ended in the same place. Nowhere. Tips dried up. Witnesses forgot small details. Evidence, what little there was, grew stale. Soon, her case was just one more folder on a crowded shelf. At the station, her photo still hung on the wall. New recruits were told about her, warned to stay sharp. But the truth was hard to face. No one had answers. The public, too, moved on. At first, her story had been front-page news. People talked about it at grocery stores, at school, and in church. But as years passed, other tragedies filled the headlines. Her name wasn't spoken as often anymore. For her family, though, time didn't heal anything. Every day felt like the day she vanished. The silence was crushing, but the uncertainty was worse. Somewhere out there was the truth. But for now, it was locked away, hidden in shadows no one could reach. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her family stood outside the courthouse. They lit candles and held up signs with her face. "Bring her home," the posters read. At first, the vigils drew crowds. Neighbors, friends, old classmates, and even strangers came to show support. People cried together, prayed together, and promised not to forget. But with each passing year, fewer showed up. The candles burned just as bright, but the circle of people grew smaller. Still, her mother never missed one. Even if only a handful came, she was there, clutching her daughter's picture, whispering her name. Reporters sometimes stopped by to take photos or run short stories, but even that grew rare. To most of the town, the missing officer had become an old wound they didn't want to reopen. To her family, it was different. For them, the vigil wasn't about news coverage or community support. It was about holding on to hope, even when everyone else had let go. Year after year, candle after candle, her mother stood in the dark, refusing to believe her daughter had been lost forever. Inside her childhood home, one room never changed. It was the bedroom she grew up in, and her mother kept it exactly as it had been the night she vanished. The bedspread was neatly tucked. The shelves were dusted and lined with small trophies, photos, and books. Her uniform shoes still sat by the closet door, polished and ready, as if she might step into them any moment. Every week her mother went in to clean. She straightened the pillows, wiped the dresser, and folded the corners of the blanket. It wasn't about tidiness. It was about hope. She told neighbors, "When she comes back, I want her room to be ready." The truth, though, was harder. The room had become a museum of what was lost. Her siblings sometimes avoided it. It was too painful to see. But for her mother, walking inside was the only way to feel close to her daughter. Years passed, fashions changed, but that room remained frozen in 1985. The family learned to live with silence. But every time her mother opened that door, she imagined the same scene, her daughter walking in, smiling and saying, "I'm home." As the years dragged on, facts turned into rumors. With no answers, the town began to make up its own stories. Some said she had simply run away. They claimed she had a secret lover and left everything behind to start a new life. It didn't matter that her family knew this wasn't true. The whispers grew louder. Others told darker stories. Maybe she had stumbled onto something dangerous, something she wasn't supposed to see. Maybe someone powerful had silenced her. Around kitchen tables and in small bars, people spoke in hushed voices, each version more dramatic than the last. For the younger generation, her case became almost like a ghost story. Parents warned their kids about driving alone at night. They spoke of the officer who vanished and was never found. The truth was no one knew anything. But in the absence of answers, rumors filled the silence. And the longer she stayed missing, the more the town's stories replaced reality. For her family, each rumor cut like a knife. To them, she wasn't a legend or a ghost story. She was their daughter, their sister, and she was still gone. One rumor, though, was harder to ignore. Some people began to wonder if the danger hadn't come from outside, but from inside the police force itself. The idea spread quietly. What if another officer had been involved? It was unthinkable. Cops trusted each other with their lives. To suggest that one of their own had turned on her felt like betrayal. But the whispers wouldn't stop. People pointed out that she knew the back roads better than anyone. She would have trusted a fellow officer enough to pull over without question. Still, there was no evidence. No strange fingerprints. No reports of trouble with her coworkers. nothing that tied anyone to her disappearance. Inside the department, the theory was poison. It damaged trust, made people suspicious of each other. But without proof, the rumor collapsed under its own weight. By the late 1990s, the story had shifted again. Most people stopped believing she was alive. To them, the mystery was no longer about where she was, but about what really happened on that lonely highway in 1985. Even as years passed, her face never left the town. Posters with her smile hung on bulletin boards at gas stations, diners, and schools. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but no one dared to take them down. Newspapers occasionally reprinted her photo for anniversary pieces. Some stores kept her flyer taped to the register, so every customer saw her eyes staring back at them. To locals, her face became part of the background, always there, like a stop sign you passed every day. But with each glance, the same question haunted people. How could someone so visible remain gone? Detectives used the posters to remind people she was still missing, but after a decade, tips barely trickled in. Many calls were from strangers claiming to have seen her in faraway states. None of them checked out. For her family, those posters were both comfort and torture. Comfort, because they proved people hadn't forgotten. Torture, because they showed the world only her smile, not the pain of her absence. Her face never faded from view, but the truth about where she was, and what had happened, remained buried somewhere no one could reach. By the mid-1990s, the weight of time began crushing even the strongest hearts in her family. Her parents still clung to the idea of a miracle, but her siblings quietly faced a harder truth. They sat together one night, years after she vanished, and admitted what no one wanted to say aloud. If she were alive, she would have come home. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with heartbreak. They loved her, but they couldn't keep pretending. The years had been too long, the silence too complete. Her mother, however, refused to hear it. She still kept the room ready. She still went to every vigil. To her, hope was not a choice, it was survival. But her siblings carried the burden differently. They still loved her fiercely, but when they looked at her photo, they no longer expected her to walk through the door. Hope had not vanished all at once. It slipped away slowly, like sand through an open hand. By the end of the decade, even those who once swore she'd return had begun to grieve not for the missing officer, but for the truth they feared they would never know. It was the summer of 2003 when the storm rolled in. At first, it was just heavy rain, something the county was used to. But by late afternoon, the sky turned black and the downpour grew violent. Lightning cracked across the hills, and thunder rattled windows. Rivers and creeks swelled within hours. Roads flooded, forcing drivers to abandon their cars. Emergency crews raced from call to call, trying to keep up. By nightfall, the storm reached its breaking point. Along a rural highway, water pounded the base of a small concrete bridge. The structure had stood for decades, but it wasn't built for this kind of pressure. Around midnight, with a roar no one nearby could miss, the bridge gave way. Concrete slabs, guardrails, and steel beams crashed down into the rushing water below. The collapse cut off one of the main routes in and out of town. For locals, it meant detours and delays. For county officials, it meant one thing: the bridge had to be repaired immediately. No one that night could have guessed what the storm had uncovered. Beneath the broken concrete, something long hidden was about to surface. By sunrise the next morning, the rain had slowed, but the damage was clear. County leaders wasted no time. That bridge was a vital link for commuters, truck drivers, and farmers. Closing it for long meant chaos. Crews were called in immediately. Construction trucks, bulldozers, and cranes rolled onto the site. Workers wore bright vests and helmets, shouting over the hum of engines. Their first job was simple: clear away the debris blocking the water. Steel beams were hauled to the side. Broken concrete chunks were dragged up the riverbank. The water was still high, muddy and fast, making every move dangerous. For the crew, it was just another long day of cleanup. Most of them focused only on the task: get the bridge cleared, make way for repairs, and move on. But as the hours passed, some workers noticed the riverbed was strange. The storm had peeled away layers of silt and mud, exposing things that had been buried for years. Old tires, scraps of metal, even broken signs were dragged out. None of it was unusual, until one worker spotted something different, something that didn't fit with the rest. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than twisted wreckage, half buried in the mud, but something about its shape made him pause. The bulldozer's blade scraped across the riverbed, pushing aside chunks of concrete. One worker leaned down, squinting at the exposed shape sticking out from the mud. It looked like metal, but not jagged or broken like the bridge beams. It was smoother, curved. At first, he thought it might be part of an old car bumper or maybe farm equipment washed down by the storm. Still, the outline tugged at him. He waved the bulldozer to stop. With a shovel, he dug around the edges, pulling away clumps of wet silt. More of the object emerged. Now he could see it clearly, a door frame, a hinge, and paint faded, rusted, but definitely paint. This wasn't random scrap. This was a vehicle. As more mud and water were cleared away, the strange outline grew larger. At first it seemed like nothing, a few panels of metal caught under the rubble, but soon a roofline appeared. Then a door, then the curve of a trunk. The workers stopped what they were doing. This wasn't just scrap. This was a full vehicle, hidden beneath the bridge for who knew how long. Men leaned over the water's edge, shouting to each other. "It's a car!" someone called out. Others ran to see for themselves. The discovery sent a buzz through the crew. Accidents weren't uncommon on rural highways. Cars sometimes slid off the road and into rivers. Maybe this was just an old crash, long forgotten. That was the first guess. But as they uncovered more, something felt different. The vehicle hadn't just drifted in. It was wedged deep into the riverbed, as though it had been forced down hard and buried over years by storm after storm. The shape was becoming unmistakable. Excited and uneasy, the foreman radioed county officials. Soon, deputies were on their way to the site. What had started as a simple bridge repair was turning into something else. By the time deputies arrived, the car was clear enough to see its full frame. It was completely rusted over. The windows were gone, shattered into jagged edges. The tires had rotted away, leaving only cracked rims. But despite nearly 2 decades under water and mud, the vehicle was still whole. Workers and police stood side by side, staring down at it. It was eerie, like the river had kept a secret, holding it in place all these years. Deputies moved closer, shining flashlights through the broken glass. The inside was caked with thick layers of silt. Nothing could be seen yet, but the idea of what might be inside hung in the air. The crew worked carefully to pull it free. Chains were hooked around the frame. A winch groaned as the rusted hulk rose inch by inch out of the muck. Mud poured out of the open windows as water streamed off the roof. The crowd watched in silence. This wasn't just a car. This was evidence. 18 years after a cop had vanished without a trace. Something that had been missing just as long was about to break the surface. The foreman didn't waste a second. As soon as the strange vehicle outline was confirmed, he called the county sheriff's office. His voice was urgent. "We've got a car under here. You'll want to see this." Deputies arrived within the hour, sirens cutting through the storm-damaged roads. When they stepped onto the muddy site, the workers led them straight to the riverbank. The deputies crouched down, shining flashlights into the murky water. One look was enough to tell them this wasn't just a piece of junk. The size, the shape, it was a full sedan. They exchanged quick glances. "This is no ordinary car," one deputy muttered. The weight of those words spread through the crew. An ordinary wreck would have been sad but expected, but this felt different. The deputies called for backup, securing the site with yellow tape. They told workers to stop digging until investigators arrived. Everyone was ordered back, though no one wanted to move far. Word spread fast. A vehicle hidden under a collapsed bridge was big news in a small county. Within hours, more law enforcement vehicles rolled in, along with curious neighbors who had heard the rumors. What lay under the water was no longer just a mystery. It was now a crime scene. By late afternoon, the decision was made. The car had to be pulled out. A massive crane rolled into position. Chains were lowered into the water, hooked around what was left of the frame. Workers tightened the rigging, stepping back as the machinery growled to life. Slowly, the rusted hulk began to rise. Mud poured from every crack, cascading into the river like thick black sludge. Water streamed off the roof in steady sheets. The sound of groaning metal filled the air. Everyone on site stopped what they were doing. Deputies, workers, and locals who had gathered all stood frozen, watching history come back to the surface. Bit by bit, the car emerged, its body crushed from years underwater. Shattered glass clung to the frames. Rust covered every inch, yet the shape remained clear, a four-door sedan. When it finally broke free of the river's grip, it swung above the water, dripping and broken. The crowd stayed silent. This wasn't just an old car. It was a grave that had been hidden for 18 years. The crane held the rusted car above the river, swinging gently as water streamed off its frame. Deputies moved closer, flashlights cutting through the mud still clinging to the doors. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder, straining to see. At first, it just looked like rust and grime. The panels were so caked with filth that no details were clear. But then, as more water slid away, faint lines began to emerge. A ghostly outline. Someone pointed, "Wait, look at that." On the driver's side door, under the streaks of brown, the shape of letters appeared. Not random scratches, painted markings. Deputies rushed forward, wiping at the mud with rags and gloves. Slowly, the image sharpened. The faded insignia came into view. Bold block letters stretched across the door, worn but unmistakable. Police. The entire crowd went silent. For nearly 2 decades, the county had carried a haunting question. What happened to the traffic cop who vanished in 1985? Now hanging in front of them was her missing patrol car. Deputies stared in disbelief. The workers shifted uneasily, realizing they hadn't just uncovered a car. They had uncovered a legend, buried beneath their feet all these years. No one spoke. The sound of dripping water was the only noise as the truth set in. This wasn't an accident scene anymore. It was the missing officer's final resting place. The patrol car was hauled from the bridge site and towed under escort to a secure police lot. Deputies cleared the area, pushing back the curious onlookers. This was no longer a construction site. It was evidence. The car sat dripping mud, its wheels sunk slightly into the gravel. The faded word "police" stretched across the rusted doors, now undeniable. Floodlights lit the area, casting long shadows across the scene. By evening, forensic teams arrived. They stepped out of vans wearing gloves, masks, and protective suits. Every movement was deliberate. They all knew the weight of what they were about to do. The lead investigator gave quiet instructions. No one touched the car without clearance. No one spoke unless necessary. Cameras flashed as evidence text documented every angle, every inch of the corroded frame. The crowd of officers who had gathered watched from behind the tape. Some had been rookies when she disappeared. Others had worked alongside her. Now they stood in silence, knowing what this likely meant. For 18 years, people had asked where she went. Now the answer was right in front of them. Inside that car, the truth was waiting. The forensic team gathered tools. A technician gripped the rusted driver's side handle and tried to pull. It didn't budge. Years of mud and corrosion had sealed it shut. They worked slowly, prying at the edges, careful not to damage what might be inside. The sound of metal straining echoed across the lot. Every officer present held their breath. Finally, with a groan, the lock gave way. The door creaked open just a few inches at first, then wider. A gush of foul water spilled onto the gravel, carrying mud and debris with it. Flashlights shone into the interior. The once clean patrol car was now a dark tomb. The seats were rotted, the dashboard half collapsed, everything coated in thick layers of silt. No one spoke. The silence was heavy. An investigator leaned closer, his light sweeping across the back seat, then the floorboard. Something pale and solid was visible under the sludge. Every officer watching knew what it meant before anyone said a word. This was no longer just a missing persons case. This was where the 18-year mystery ended. The car wasn't empty. The flashlight beam steadied on the driver's seat. What at first looked like pale debris slowly took shape. There, slumped forward over the wheel, were bones. The skeleton was half buried in mud, ribs collapsed inward, the skull tilted down. The years of water had stripped everything away but the frame of a human being. Even so, it was clear. Someone had been behind that wheel when the car went under. Gasps rippled through the officers watching. Some turned away. Others stared in disbelief, frozen in place. This wasn't just a wreck, it was a grave. Forensic techs moved in carefully, documenting the position of every bone, every fragment. They spoke in low voices, careful not to disturb what had been preserved for so long. 18 years of rumors, theories, and unanswered questions had just come to a stop. The missing officer was here. After all the searches, vigils, and desperate prayers, the truth had been sitting in the river the entire time, hidden under mud and silence. The patrol car was no accident site now. It was evidence, a time capsule, and the final resting place of a fellow officer. As the team worked closer, their lights revealed more. Near the skeleton's waist, half buried in muck, lay a rusted gun belt. The leather had rotted away, but the holster and buckle still clung to the frame. Then came the detail that made every officer in the lot go quiet. Pinned to the remains of the uniform was a badge. It was dull, caked in dirt, but when a technician brushed it gently with a gloved hand, the metal caught the light. The insignia still shone faintly. A crushed uniform, a gun belt, a badge. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just any officer. This was their officer, the one who had vanished without a trace almost 2 decades ago. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence said everything. She had been found. The discovery was both heartbreaking and relieving. After 18 years, her family and her department finally had an answer. But the sight in front of them only raised more painful questions. How did her car end up under the bridge? Was this a tragic accident, or something much darker? The forensic team slowly stepped back from the cruiser. Gloves muddy, faces pale, they knew there was no more doubt. The case that had haunted the department for nearly 2 decades was over. It was her, the young traffic officer who had signed off her last radio call in 1985, was finally accounted for. She hadn't run away. She hadn't vanished into thin air. She had been here, locked inside her patrol car, just beneath the river's surface all along. The weight of it settled heavily over the group. A few officers removed their hats. Others lowered their heads in silence. This was no longer just an investigation. This was a moment of respect for one of their own. Some thought of her family, how every birthday, every holiday they had prayed for answers. Now the truth was here, though it was not the one anyone had hoped for. 18 years of searching, and she had been under their feet the whole time. The silence stretched on. In that moment, every officer present felt the same thing: sorrow, relief, and the haunting knowledge that the story was not yet over. With the discovery confirmed, investigators shifted focus. They needed to know how this had happened. They circled the rusted cruiser, studying every inch of the twisted metal. The front end showed heavy damage, as if it had struck water or rocks at high speed. The windows had long since shattered, letting mud and silt pour inside. Maps were pulled, old bridge reports reviewed. The location made sense. In 1985, the officer's patrol route would have taken her across this exact bridge. If she had lost control, the car could have vaulted off the edge, plunging straight into the river below. Once underwater, storms and shifting currents would have buried the vehicle deeper in the riverbed. Over time, layers of mud sealed it completely out of sight. Divers in the original search would never have seen it. To them, it was as if the car had never existed. Now, with the bridge collapse exposing the wreck, the timeline became clearer. She had likely gone off the road that very night, 18 years ago. It explained the silence, the unanswered radio calls, the endless mystery. At last, investigators had a working theory. It had all ended in seconds, on a dark highway in 1985. Investigators looked at the wreck and shook their heads. It was clear how the car had stayed hidden for so long. After plunging into the river, the cruiser must have sunk fast, its heavy frame dragging it straight into the soft riverbed. At first, maybe part of it was visible. Maybe a corner of the roof or a shattered window stuck out. But the river never stayed still. Storm after storm rolled through the county. Each one churned up silt and sand, pushing layer after layer over the wreck. Season after season, the car sank deeper. By the time divers searched the river in 1985, it was already invisible, covered in thick mud. From the surface, the river looked normal, calm, quiet, empty. No one could have guessed a police cruiser, along with its officer, was sealed just beneath. For nearly 2 decades, it remained that way, hidden, untouched, waiting. The bridge collapse in 2003 had changed everything. When tons of concrete and steel slammed into the water, it tore through the riverbed. That sudden shift peeled back the layers of silt, just enough to expose the metal underneath. Without that accident, the car might have stayed buried forever. The day after the cruiser was pulled from the river, the sheriff's office made it official. The missing officer's case, once stamped unsolved and filed away, was reopened. After nearly 2 decades, the story wasn't over. It was just beginning again. Detectives old and new gathered in the briefing room. Boxes of dusty files were hauled out from storage, spread across long tables. Photos of the officer, her smiling face in uniform, were pinned once again to the board at the front. Beside them, crime scene shots of the recovered cruiser, mud-caked, rusted, and broken, were added to the evidence wall. The room carried a strange mix of hope and dread. On one hand, there were finally answers. She hadn't run away, she hadn't abandoned her life. She had died in that car. On the other hand, the biggest question still hung in the air. How? The case detectives knew from 1985 was no longer a disappearance. It was now a death investigation. Was it an accident, or was it murder? Teams were assigned. Forensics would study every inch of the car. Investigators would revisit old leads and re-interview anyone connected to the officer. Even retired officers were asked to come in and give statements again. The case everyone thought was dead had just come roaring back to life. The first question detectives asked was simple. Did she drive off that bridge by mistake, or did someone force her? Looking at the wreck, both answers seemed possible. The bridge in 1985 had been narrow, slick in the rain, with no guardrail strong enough to stop a heavy cruiser. If she lost control, the car could have plunged straight down. An accident was believable. But then came the doubts. This was a trained officer used to those roads. She wasn't reckless. She didn't drink. And there was no sign she had swerved to avoid an animal or debris. To some investigators, the idea she simply lost control felt too easy. The darker theory was harder to ignore. What if another vehicle had been involved? A nudge, a hit, or someone blocking her path could have sent her into the water. If that happened, it wasn't bad luck. It was murder. Detectives studied dents in the car, though years underwater had destroyed much of the evidence. What was accident, and what was time and rust? That question would haunt the investigation. The truth was buried in the wreckage, and it wasn't giving up answers easily. The patrol car was hauled into a covered garage, lights glaring down on it like a body in an autopsy room. Forensic experts circled the wreck, clipboards in hand, masks on their faces. The years in the river had eaten away most of the metal, leaving rusted panels and collapsed seats. Still, they searched. They measured dents along the driver's side, trying to decide if they came from an impact or from the crushing force of the bridge's collapse. They scraped at the frame, looking for paint from another vehicle. Nothing clear appeared. Every mark could be explained either by an accident or by foul play. Inside, the mud and water had destroyed nearly everything. The steering wheel was bent, but was that from the crash itself or from years underwater? The windshield was shattered, but again, no way to know when it broke. It was like looking at a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The experts wanted answers, but the car refused to give them. What they did know was simple. There was no clear proof she lost control, but there was also no proof anyone else forced her off the road. The mystery only deepened. While forensics worked on the car, detectives buried themselves in paperwork. Old files were dragged out of boxes, spread across desks. Every case the officer had worked in the months before her disappearance was reopened. They looked at her traffic stops. Had she pulled over someone dangerous? Was there a driver who swore revenge? They looked at her arrest logs. Had she taken down someone with connections, someone who might want payback? The deeper they went, the more names they circled. A repeat drunk driver who had cursed her out in court. A man she arrested for domestic violence who told friends he'd get even. Even a small-time criminal who swore cops were out to ruin his life. But then came the bigger question. Had she stumbled into something bigger? Detectives whispered about the possibility she discovered something she wasn't supposed to, maybe corruption, maybe a deal gone wrong. If so, who would silence her? For every file they reopened, new questions appeared. Yet none of the suspects had the kind of link that explained a car in a river. By the end of the week, detectives realized the truth. The answers they wanted weren't in the files. They had to look elsewhere. As the investigation pushed forward, theories began to pile up. Detectives argued over the possibilities, but none of them could be proven. Some believed the answer was simple. A criminal had taken revenge. She was known for being strict on the road. She had arrested repeat offenders, handed out tough tickets, and angered plenty of people in the process. Maybe one of them waited for her on the highway that night. Maybe they forced her off the bridge. Others weren't so sure. Quietly, whispers began to spread inside the department itself. What if this wasn't just about some angry driver? What if the danger had been closer than anyone wanted to admit? Corruption was a word nobody wanted to say out loud, but the thought lingered. Could another officer have played a role? Could someone on the inside have known where she was and made sure she never came back? The problem was simple. There was no proof either way. Every lead collapsed into speculation. Every theory had holes. For some, it felt easier to believe it was an accident. For others, the unanswered questions screamed that it was not. The divide left the case hanging in limbo, with no clear path forward. Detectives tried everything. The cruiser was torn apart piece by piece, but years underwater had destroyed nearly every clue. Rust covered the frame. Mud had filled every gap. If there had once been evidence of another vehicle hitting her, it was long gone. They interviewed old witnesses again, hoping that time might unlock some forgotten detail. But memories had faded. People who once swore they saw something now hesitated. Dates blurred together. Some had even passed away, taking whatever they knew with them. The team also revisited old tips and rumors. Was there a stranger on the road that night? Did anyone see a second car near the bridge? Each report ended in the same way. No hard proof. Even forensics couldn't give answers. The skeleton was too fragile, the remains too incomplete. No signs of violence could be confirmed. But at the same time, nothing could rule it out either. The result was a frustrating middle ground. Too many questions, not enough answers. Every lead was like a door that slammed shut as soon as it opened. Detectives felt the pressure mounting. Families wanted answers. The town wanted closure, and the department wanted the case resolved. But the truth was buried in time, and no one could dig it out. Months of work came to a quiet end. The file grew thicker but not clearer. Detectives knew they had to make a call. Without physical evidence of another car, without witnesses who could confirm foul play, there was little left to stand on. The final report leaned toward one explanation: accident. The theory was that she had lost control on the bridge that night in 1985. Maybe rain made the road slick. Maybe she swerved to avoid an animal or even a pedestrian. Either way, the car plunged off the edge and straight into the water below. On paper, it seemed simple. But for her family, it was anything but. Her parents read the report in silence. It didn't sit right. She was a skilled driver trained to handle emergencies. She wasn't reckless, and the bridge wasn't in poor condition back then. How could she just lose control? Her siblings asked the question no one wanted to. If it really was an accident, why did it take 18 years to find her? Neighbors echoed the same doubt. How could an entire police cruiser sit under a bridge unseen, while helicopters, divers, and dogs searched mile after mile? The answer never came. The file was closed again, stamped with words her family hated to see: accidental death. But in their hearts, the case remained unsolved. In the summer of 2003, the church in town filled with silence. The pews were lined with officers in uniform, hats held against their chests. Neighbors, friends, and strangers who only knew her from the news sat shoulder to shoulder. At the front of the aisle rested a closed coffin. Inside were the remains taken from the river: bones, bits of her uniform, the rusted gun belt, and her badge. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for a proper burial. After nearly 2 decades of waiting, her family could finally give her the respect she deserved. Her mother clutched a folded photograph, the same one she had kept by her bedside all these years. Her father sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the coffin, refusing to look away. Her siblings carried flowers, their faces older now but still marked with the same grief they felt as children. The pastor spoke softly, calling her a servant of the community who gave her life in uniform. Officers saluted as the coffin was carried outside. The sound of bagpipes filled the air. For the family, it was a day of both closure and heartbreak. They finally had a grave to visit, but the questions of how and why remained unanswered. The funeral drew people from far beyond the county lines. Officers in pressed uniforms arrived from neighboring towns, some who had never even met her but understood the weight of losing one of their own. Retired deputies came too, walking slowly with canes, their faces lined with years of service. Neighbors who remembered her smile in the grocery store stood quietly beside strangers who had only followed the case through newspapers. Parents brought their children, telling them this was a chance to honor someone who had once kept their road safe. Inside the church, the pews were so full that people stood in the aisles. Outside, a crowd gathered on the lawn, listening through open windows. The loss of one young officer had spread far, touching lives that never directly crossed hers. When the pastor spoke, he said this wasn't just about one woman's life. It was about what disappeared with her that night in 1985. Safety, trust, a sense of certainty that if trouble came, she would be there to help. The community had lost all of that in one moment. As the coffin was carried from the church, the crowd fell into silence. It was not only grief for her, it was grief for everything that had been stolen from them the night she vanished. When the last hymn faded and the crowd began to drift away, the silence felt heavier than the ceremony itself. Families stepped back into their cars, officers saluted one last time, and the churchyard slowly emptied. But even as people returned to their daily lives, the questions refused to leave with them. How could a marked police cruiser sit hidden beneath a bridge for almost 2 decades? How many times had drivers passed over that same stretch of road, never knowing what lay just a few feet below? Some muttered that if the bridge had been checked earlier, she could have been found years ago. Others wondered about the original investigation. How could trained detectives miss something so close to her last known location? For her family, these questions were unbearable. Each "what if" only deepened their pain. Could she have been found sooner? Could the truth have come earlier, sparing them years of vigils, sleepless nights, and false hope? The silence after the funeral wasn't peace. It was the sound of questions no one could answer. In the weeks that followed, the town split into two camps. One side believed firmly that she had been forced off the road. They pointed to the rumors of enemies, the whispers of corruption, and the possibility of an ambush. To them, it was clear. Someone wanted her gone and they had succeeded. The other side rejected that idea. They said it was simply a tragic accident. A rainy night, a slick road, and a missed guardrail, nothing more. They argued that people were trying to invent mystery where there was none. At diners, barbershops, and gas stations, the debate played out over and over. Some residents leaned in close, insisting she uncovered something dangerous. Others shook their heads, saying tragedy doesn't always need a villain. Both theories carried weight, both carried doubt, and because the evidence was buried under years of mud and time, neither could be proven. In the end, the town was left holding two competing truths: accident or murder. Each person decided for themselves which version they believed. For the family, the discovery should have been the end of the nightmare. They finally had answers. They finally had a place to grieve, a coffin to bury, and a truth to hold onto. But closure didn't come so easily. Her mother admitted what she had never said out loud before. From the very first night, she knew her daughter hadn't left willingly. She hadn't run away, hadn't abandoned her post, hadn't chosen to disappear. She was proud of her job, proud of the uniform, and proud of the people she served. Her mother never doubted that. Now, knowing her daughter had been trapped beneath that bridge for almost 2 decades, the truth cut even deeper. All those years of searching, of waiting by the phone, of lighting candles in the dark. Her daughter had been so close the entire time. The hardest part wasn't knowing how she died. It was knowing where she was, just under their feet, hidden by mud and water, while the family prayed for answers that were already there. The case was closed on paper, but for her family, it never really closed at all. The struggle was learning how to live with the haunting truth. For a short time, the discovery was front-page news. Reporters filled the streets. Cameras flashed at the bridge. The story of a missing officer, finally found after 18 years, shocked everyone. But then just as quickly the headlines moved on. No one was arrested. No one was blamed. There were no new laws passed about bridge safety or missing officer protocols. Officially, the file was marked accident. And once the papers printed that conclusion, the story slipped back into silence. Inside the department, some officers wanted answers. They believed their colleague deserved more than a one-line ending, but without proof of foul play, there was nothing to fight. The crash was ruled tragic but ordinary, a routine accident, lost in time. Her family tried to push for change. They asked why divers hadn't searched under the bridge back in 1985. They asked how a police cruiser, painted, marked, impossible to miss, could sit in plain water for nearly 2 decades without being found. No one had answers. Officials only repeated the same words. It was hidden in the mud. The years passed and the case became just another file in the cabinet. People stopped talking. The posters came down. The vigils ended. What was once the town's greatest mystery faded into memory. For her family, that was the hardest truth of all. Their daughter's disappearance and discovery changed nothing. She became a story people whispered about once, then forgot. And the silence that followed felt almost as cruel as the years she was missing. Even though the case was officially closed, her name never truly faded. Writers added her to lists of unsolved mysteries. Podcasters debated whether it was really an accident. Local newspapers ran anniversary articles, always with the same headline: "The Officer in the River." In town, her picture still hung on a few bulletin boards. At the diner, people still mentioned her when storms rolled in. It became part of the town's identity, how a young officer could vanish in her cruiser, and how nobody knew the truth for almost 20 years. Some residents swore the department covered something up. Others said fate played the cruelest trick, hiding her car just out of reach. The mystery split the town, and even now, opinions haven't settled. Her family carried the weight most of all. They wanted peace, but the attention meant the wound never closed. Every new podcast episode or book chapter brought the pain back, forcing them to relive it. Yet they also admitted something. At least her story wasn't forgotten. Because the truth was simple, cases like this don't disappear. They stay alive in whispers, in rumors, in late-night conversations. A police officer in uniform, vanishing without a trace, only to be found by accident 18 years later. That kind of story doesn't go away. And in that sense, she became something more than just another name in a file. She became a reminder that mysteries don't always end cleanly. That sometimes the answers sit right in front of us, buried in plain sight. Her story, even decades later, still echoes.